Thanks. Andy?
Again, I think is that on? Yeah. I think there was some overlap, but I don't want to miss, I think, some of the passion that was expressed in our group, and again, I'd like to as well echo the thank yous for, I think, what was a very good discussion and some meaningful input from the group that was right next door. The discussion started off really with that centering, and it was really, to a certain extent, it was a geographical discussion, but the idea of citizenship or residency needs to be recognized within this process. And it got brought around to, I think, a meaningful discussion of how maybe this whole thing is going to develop as people were expressing their different views, people who lived in the region, people who didn't live in the region, and they were incorporated into what we started modeling as a bit of a process for this to go forward. So I could see it working even today. The idea of community stewardship needs to be built into it, and there has to be some sort of trust in any representation that you have going forward, and that's going to be the challenge of many of the sectors of what that representation will be and how to achieve it. There needs to be capacity building, and we need to be able to identify what stakeholders are going to have representation in this process, but being careful not to put lines on a map. That came through quite clearly. In other words, making it an us or them, because everyone will have some contribution to what's needed in terms of information and sharing. And what everyone took from some of the talks that was going on here was the alternatives to consensus, and that we needed to consider what some of those were, because consensus would not always be necessarily possible. And on that note, communication, of course, needs to be open, so that people in the region aren't being told what's going to be happening in their region or within their area or within their communities. So we then got into a little bit more concrete discussion of process and what process was going to need to come out of this. And it needed, I think one of the ways it was described was for a common PNCIMA process with decisions made at the local level. And that it's regional and community based. The concept of a subsidiarity, where decision making is at the lowest level possible, might be something that would be one of the principles that would help to guide it, and that people needed to be responsible for cleaning their house. Again, I think we heard it before, the idea of building from the community out, and also being able to share information back into there. There were suggested 4 principles as part of the discussion. One was that you needed to have some guiding principles that everyone could agree to, and whether they be principles of engagement or principles of ecosystem or of protection, there needed to be some principles that were set forward for the engagement. Scale needed to be considered, and understand what mechanism was required at each level. Accountability, so that each sector or representation would be maintained and there'd be follow-through, and that there was a model of decision making. And again, that went back to the alternatives to consensus, so that you'd be able to foster agreement at the highest level. There was also suggested that we don't need to reinvent. I mean, I think we saw some models that were presented, and that there are some things that are at work right now that just we can use that are working quite well. And one of the examples was the West Coast Aquatic Management Board. It seems to be working well, and that it's based on constituents being involved in it and being responsible for their own area. Timing was mentioned, as it was in the others. The idea of deadlines was also put in there, that sometimes having a deadline makes people work and get down to some of the action. We asked the question about representation, and there was, again, reinforcement of the idea that you needed to apply to represent, and that there needed to be some model that would help to make that application process work, and that would also tie into the accountability, that if people were selected and were applying or had to go through a process to be a representative, there would be accountability back to their people. One of the questions that came out of that was, how will offshore oil and gas be included? Will they be included, really was the question, and how will that work, or will they have their own table? There's a concern, of course, about capacity to sway decision making. There's a need to continue to recognize local authority and what's happening locally, and that whatever is created has some capacity to monitor, implement, and follow through. And it's a model that's happening right now with many First Nations communities. And again, no need to reinvent some of the things that are going on. We need to find a way to make use of them. One of the last statements was that there's a need for some leadership from here on out, from this forum, that will refine, massage, do something about this process, and then bring it back regionally to the communities, and then start to get some input as we start to get a bit of a roadmap for the direction that it's going. I hope that did you justice for all the great input. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Jessica.
Thanks to my group as well. Oh, this one. Thanks. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Thanks to my group as well. I'm going to go through this quickly because we're short on time, and that seems to be the theme of the forum. Some really good stuff and concrete things came out. Any process that is developed for stakeholder engagement needs to ensure good communication and exchange of information that also respects the need for privacy on some issues, for whatever reason that may be, cultural, legal, and so builds that in. A mechanism to deal with that is there's a suggestion that there's some technology out there, software, that can handle these kinds of things quite easily. There needs to ensure accessibility of information to people. Some of the suggestions for handling that are posting on websites, questions and answers posted, and ensuring that the answers to the questions are actually posted. Progress reports also being shared in that way. Any process needs to utilize complementary and connected information and data streams that value both local traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. Some ways to address that would be around having some citizens committees, establishments of boards that are both local and traditional knowledge and technological, science-based, peer review / community review, and having some evidence-based evaluation of the data. One of the big pieces that came out, and I think this is a need that needs to be incorporated, different types of meetings for different purposes and different contexts. And that addresses a number of things that need to be thought about. Context-specific, time allocation, the technical nature of things, relationship building, so being sensitive to that and having some flexibility. Any process needs to recognize and allow for difference in order to enhance dialogue and encourage honesty. So having really honest discussions and feeling okay about the difference in the room. So recognizing that there needs to be things developed and put in place in this process to allow for that. Some of the on-the-ground suggestions around how to manage that would be developing rules of order, terms of reference, having independent chairs, independent note takers, providing some facilitation and negotiation training.